On today's episode of Dream Farm, I want to talk about what is arguably the deer's most preferred browse plant, and that is Red Osier Dogwood. And I've planted it on this farm now for two springs, and I want to show you the locations where I've planted it, how well it did, how well it survived, how much the deer are utilizing it, and then maybe some things that I would do different. I've also planted other of the more preferred browse species this spring, the 9-bark and hazelnut, and I'll keep close tabs on those too, and we'll take a look at them next year and see how they did, how they grew, and again, how the deer reacted to them. And the number one thing you're always trying to figure out is, can you grow it without the deer destroying it, and then it doesn't produce anything useful long term. And the question is always, the deer density, how high does the deer density have to be before you can't grow some of these preferred browse species without caging them? And that's what I aim to find out. We know that my density is somewhere in the 65 deer per square mile range. We did that thermal drone survey this past winter, and that's what the Jack Houston came up with. So that's not super high. So it's going to be interesting to see, even with that density, whether or not I could get the Red Osier Dogwood to survive here without caging it. Dream Farm is brought to you by Whitetail Institute. Research equals results. Hunt Stand Pro Whitetail app. Hoyt Archery, Wildlife Farming, and PH Outdoors. This is location number 1. There's a kind of a natural small pond here, and everything I'd read about the Red Osier Dogwood suggested that it likes wet locations, places where maybe it's almost year-round, a little bit wet. So this spot made sense. I'm looking at it now. I'm going to show it to you. Overall, I would say there's not a bunch of it left. I bet you we've put in maybe 75 plants here. They're small bushes, maybe somewhere in that neighborhood. And I'll look around here and I can see there's 1, 2, 3, 4. I can see a few of them. Let's take a look and see how many are left. At this location, I would say that most of the little plants that we put in are still here. They more or less survived, but maybe, I'm looking around still, and I'd say that more than half of them survived over the course of about 13 or 14 months. The problem is the deer are browsing them really hard, and I'm not sure that long term there's any hope for them, unfortunately. And I think that's going to be the case on some of these other locations that we checked too. I mean, there's a couple of them here, a couple of these plants that actually look pretty good, so maybe there is still some hope, but they're not thriving by any means. The deer are just working them over too hard. The last location was right on the edge of a food plot. This one's tucked just a little ways back into the timber in this old pond that doesn't hold water. So again, I figured it'd be, moister soil, which the Red Osier prefers. So let's take a look here and just see if being more removed from that destination, that food plot, allowed this stuff to survive better. So based on what I've seen in the first 2 locations, I would not plant Red Osier Dogwood anywhere without caging it. Kind of think about that from the standpoint of what good does it do if you plant it if you have to cage it, because the whole idea of having it here is for the deer to eat. But I guess if the cage is small enough, the plant will grow through it, and the deer can eat the parts that come outside of the cage every year, and that preserves at least the main stem of the plant, keeps it alive. I'm not sure, based on just how high maintenance that would be, even in a density that's this relatively low, that I would do it. We'll see. I mean, if you don't have a lot of acres, you know, caging, you know, 25 of these probably isn't any big deal, but 25 of them is a drop in the bucket on this place, and I just don't want to do stuff that takes a lot of maintenance. I want stuff that's pretty low maintenance, pretty carefree, things that I can get established and then just let them go. For example, I'd way rather put in a couple of apple trees now, you know, in hindsight, than the Red Osier Dogwood, because once they get established and growing, they're going to be dropping food forever, basically, as long as they're healthy. Whereas these dogwood, it's going to be a constant battle to keep them alive and to really use them to produce any reasonable amount of forage. So let's look at a couple more locations. I've got spots that are maybe not quite so close to the timber and see if the deer are utilizing those less. The spot where I'm at right now is pretty close to the buildings. It was one that Jordan and I planted this past spring, just about a month ago. I think there were 50 of them that we put in here, and then 50 in another spot. And again, I look for spots, locations that were maybe a little bit more moist. It's down through this valley here. There's a lot of grass kind of covering it up right now, and it's close to the buildings. And I haven't been around a whole lot, so it's not as if the deer are being chased away from this location, but still, it's probably not a, you know, an area that they come to a lot. This looks good. I mean, there's what's here appears to be growing pretty well, and doesn't seem to show a lot of sign of being heavily browsed by the deer. So I'm gonna look at the next spot. It was another one that we planted this spring, the other 50 plants, and see how they're doing. They're further away from the buildings, and I don't think the grass there was quite as thick. We'll see if the deer have discovered them and what they're doing. This spot, they look pretty good. This was, like I said, another one that we planted this spring. And it's not real close to the buildings, but at the same time, it's not, you know, way back into the timber someplace either. So there's some chance for this to survive. Jury is still out. I've got to give it a year, let the deer see if they find it, and then if they do, if they just basically browse it down to the stem like they did those other locations. So based on what I've seen so far, I'm not going to plant any more of it. I don't want to cage stuff. It's just too much trouble. So if I'm going to plant something here, it's going to be something that can be maintained without, you know, having to cage it forever. So in other words, I'm thinking maybe if I had to choose between Red Osier Dogwood or, let's say, apple trees or plum trees or pear trees, I'm definitely going to go with the trees, because once you get them established, you know, then they're going to continue to produce, you know, food for the deer without you having to babysit them like you would with something like this. Plus, I don't want something that the only way it can grow is if it's inside of a cage forever, because all you're looking at then is these cages with all the, you know, the branches and limbs and stuff, you know, mowed off right on the edge. I don't really want my farm to look like that. So I'm a little disappointed, but they just don't grow. This stuff just doesn't grow fast enough to grow ahead of the deer, and the deer like it too well. Even in an area like this with limited deer density, it's just not feasible. And again, like I said, we'll keep an eye on this spot, but My guess is that by this time next year, it's just going to be stems, just like the other two locations that we looked at that were planted 13 months ago. You give this another year and the deer are going to have located it, and they're going to be zeroing in on it and nipping those off right away every year when it starts to grow new leaves. This spot didn't change my mind either. This was another, as I mentioned, location that I planted 13 months ago. None of it's alive that I can tell. I don't think it's 100% due to the deer. This one was a little bit more upland, not quite in as low and wet of an area. So that might be part of the reason why this stuff is, I mean, it's not dead, it doesn't snap off. It just doesn't have any leaves on it. It's just a stem, you know, it kind of does snap off, I guess. All right, so that's the end of it. I'm not going to talk about Red Osier Dogwood anymore. I'm not going to plant it anymore. I'm going to focus on other stuff that is easier to maintain, that the deer don't hammer quite as hard. It doesn't make any sense to plant something for the deer and then try to prevent the deer from eating it. I guess the goal would be to find something that once you've got it established, it serves its purpose without you having to defend it every year. So that's it for this episode. Wraps up my thoughts. I mean, I know I'm going to get a lot of comments on this because surely there are people out there that have successfully planted this stuff and managed it as part of their, you know, their overall plan for their farms. But it's not going to be one that I pursue anymore here. Well, I appreciate you joining me. I'll see you back here again soon for the next episode of Dream Farm. And remember to always dream big.